In the quaint village of Chipping Barnet, a deadly sip of tea shatters the tranquility of Rose Cottage. When Lydia Pritchard collapses, poisoned by foxglove at a morning gathering, Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and gentle demeanour, is summoned to unravel the truth. Beneath the elegance of silver teapots and blooming roses lies a web of greed and betrayal, a forged document, a scheming nephew, a loyal housekeeper with a fatal secret. As accusations fly and clues emerge from the garden's wild patch, Miss Marple pieces together a puzzle where loyalty masks murder. Will she expose the killer before another cup is poured? In this classic Agatha Christie mystery, every petal hides a thorn. Chapter 1. The Village Summons. Miss Jane Marple sat in the familiar comfort of her parlour in St. Mary Mead, her knitting needles moving with the quiet rhythm of habit, crafting a pale blue shawl that draped across her lap like a soft cloud. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the polished mahogany table beside her, where a bone china teacup rested, its contents cooling in the gentle warmth of the room. The air carried the faint scent of lavender from a bowl of potpourri on the mantel, mingling with the crisp aroma of freshly baked scones delivered by her neighbour, Mrs. Price, only an hour before. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp and undimmed despite her advancing years, were fixed not on her knitting but on a letter that lay open beside the teacup, its cream-coloured paper embossed with a rose motif and penned in an elegant, looping hand. The letter had arrived with the morning post, delivered by young Tommy Pierce, whose cheerful whistle had announced his presence long before his knock. It was from Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, an old acquaintance from Miss Marple's school days at Miss Featherstone's academy in Bath, a time when both were young girls navigating the strictures of deportment and Latin. Eleanor, then Eleanor Whitby, had been a poised, thoughtful girl, her auburn hair and quiet dignity setting her apart even then. Now, as the widow of Mr. Harold Pritchard, a textile merchant of considerable means, she resided at Rose Cottage in the neighbouring village of Chipping Barnet, a place known for its quaint charm and thriving rose gardens. The letter's tone was polite, but laced with an undercurrent of urgency that piqued Miss Marple's curiosity. "Dear Jane, your presence is requested at Rose Cottage for morning tea tomorrow. A matter most delicate requires your insight, which I have always admired. I trust you will come." The signature, Eleanor Pritchard, was followed by a postscript. "Discretion is paramount." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her fingers tracing the edge of the letter as she considered its implications. Eleanor was not given to exaggeration. Her life, as far as Miss Marple recalled, had been one of measured calm, even after the loss of her husband 5 years prior. Yet the words delicate matter and discretion suggested trouble brewing beneath the surface of Rose Cottage's idyllic facade. Miss Marple's mind, ever attuned to the subtleties of human nature, recalled fragments of village gossip about the Pritchard household. Eleanor lived with her stepdaughter, Lydia, a young woman of 28, whose beauty was matched by a rumoured restlessness. There was also Thomas Pritchard, Eleanor's nephew by marriage, a solicitor with a sharp tongue and sharper ambitions, known in Chipping Barnet for his dealings in property and investments. The household was completed by Mrs. Agnes Baxter, a housekeeper of long service, and a young maid, Polly, whose nervous demeanour had been mentioned by Mrs. Price during a recent chat over tea. A final figure, Reverend Simon Hale, the local vicar, was a frequent visitor, his presence a staple at Eleanor's gatherings. Miss Marple rose, her movements deliberate, and crossed to the window, parting the lace curtains to gaze at the neat garden beyond. The dahlias were in full bloom, their vibrant heads nodding in the breeze, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She had always believed that human nature was much the same, whether in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead or the grander estates of the county. A delicate matter could mean many things: a family dispute, a financial strain, or something darker. She recalled a conversation with her nephew Raymond, who often teased her about her village parallels. But Miss Marple knew that the patterns of greed, jealousy, and fear were universal, as evident in Chipping Barnet as in her own parish. The decision to accept Eleanor's invitation was made with little hesitation. Miss Marple returned to her chair, took up her pen, and wrote a brief reply on her monogrammed stationery. "Dear Eleanor, I shall be delighted to join you for tea tomorrow. Yours, sincerely, Jane Marple." She sealed the envelope and placed it on the hall table for Tommy's afternoon round, then resumed her knitting, her needles clicking as her mind began to weave a different sort of pattern, one of possibilities and suspicions. The following morning, Miss Marple dressed with her usual care, selecting a tweed coat of soft grey, its cut sensible yet elegant, and a felt hat adorned with a single pheasant feather, a nod to her understated style. Her knitting bag, containing the blue shawl and a small notebook, was tucked under her arm as she made her way to the St. Mary Mead station. The 9:15 train to Chipping Barnet was a short journey, no more than 20 minutes, and Miss Marple settled into a second-class carriage, her eyes scanning her fellow passengers. A vicar, absorbed in a hymn book, muttered softly to himself, while a young mother wrestled with a fidgety toddler, her face a study in weary patience. A gentleman in a tweed suit, his briefcase bulging with papers, glanced repeatedly at his pocket watch, as if time were his adversary. Miss Marple observed them all, her mind noting details: the vicar's ink-stained fingers, the mother's frayed gloves, the gentleman's nervous tickers. She did with all things, for one never knew what might prove significant. The train rattled through the countryside, its fields golden with late summer wheat, its hedgerows dotted with blackberries. Chipping Barnet Station was a modest affair, a single platform flanked by flower baskets and a ticket office manned by a cheerful porter. A pony cart, driven by a lanky youth with a cap pulled low, awaited her, its wooden wheels creaking as it carried her along the winding lanes to Rose Cottage. The village was as charming as she remembered, its thatched cottages and cobbled high street exuding a timeless tranquility. Yet Miss Marple's eyes, ever alert, noted signs of life beneath the shopkeeper sweeping his doorstep with unusual vigor, to women whispering outside the post office, their glances darting toward the cart. Rose Cottage came into view as they rounded a bend, its ivy-clad walls and steeply pitched roof a picture of pastoral beauty. The garden was a riot of colour, with roses in every hue-crimson blush, and ivory climbing trellises and spilling over stone walls. The air was heavy with their fragrance, a sweetness that seemed at odds with the tension Miss Marple sensed. As she approached, Eleanor Pritchard stood at the gate, her silver hair swept into a neat chignon, her navy dress tailored to perfection. But her smile was tight, her hazel eyes shadowed with worry. "Jane, how good of you to come," Eleanor said, extending a gloved hand. Her voice was warm but strained, as if she were holding back a tide of emotion. "I trust the journey was pleasant." "Most pleasant, Eleanor," Miss Marple replied, her tone soothing. "Your garden is as splendid as ever. The roses, they are magnificent." Eleanor's smile flickered. "They are my pride, but lately I've had little time to tend them." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes catching the slight tremor in Eleanor's hand as she led the way to the front door. The hall was cool and dim, its polished floorboards gleaming under a crystal chandelier, modest but elegant. A portrait of Harold, Pritchard, stern and mustachioed, hung above the staircase, his gaze seeming to follow them as they passed. Eleanor ushered her into the morning room, a cheerful space with floral wallpaper and a bay window overlooking the rose garden. A silver tea service was set on a lace-covered table, its surface adorned with scones, a dish of strawberry jam, and a bowl of clotted cream. The scent of freshly brewed tea mingled with the rose's perfume drifting through an open window. "Please, Jane, make yourself comfortable," Eleanor said, gesturing to a cushioned chair. "The others will join us shortly." Miss Marple settled into the chair, her knitting bag at her feet, and observed the room. A vase of roses, freshly cut, stood on a sideboard, their petals vibrant but one or two wilting at the edges. Small detail, but one that spoke of neglect. The furniture was polished to a mirror shine, the cushions plumped, yet there was an air of strain, as if the room's order masked a deeper disquiet. The door opened, and Lydia Pritchard entered, a striking young woman with dark curls cascading over her shoulders and a restless energy in her movements. Her dress, a soft green silk, accentuated her pale complexion, but her eyes were red-rimmed, her smile forced. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice light but brittle, "how kind of you to visit. Aunt Eleanor speaks so highly of you." "You are most gracious, Miss Pritchard," Miss Marple replied, her eyes noting Lydia's trembling hands as she adjusted a rose in the vase. "Your aunt's roses are a marvel. Do you share her passion for gardening?" Lydia's smile wavered. "I try, but I lack her skill. The garden is her domain." Before Miss Marple could probe further, Thomas Pritchard strode in, his lean frame clad in a sharply tailored suit, his dark hair slicked back, his features sharp and angular. He carried an air of authority, but his eyes flicked nervously too. "Eleanor," then to Lydia. "Miss Marple," he said, bowing slightly, "a pleasure. I trust you'll enjoy Chipping Barnet's charms." "I'm sure I shall," Miss Marple said, her tone mild but her gaze keen. Thomas's confidence seemed a veneer, his fingers drumming briefly on the table before he sat. Mrs. Agnes Baxter, the housekeeper, followed, a stout woman with a severe bun and a plain black dress that gave her a formidable air. Her hands, rough from years of work, smoothed her apron as she stood near the door, her eyes darting between the guests. "Tea's ready, ma'am," she said to Eleanor, her voice clipped but deferential. "Thank you, Mrs. Baxter," Eleanor replied, her tone strained. "Polly will serve." Polly, the young maid, entered with a nervous step, her apron slightly askew, her blonde hair escaping its cap. She carried a tray of teacups, her hands trembling as she set them down, nearly upsetting a saucer. "Sorry, ma'am," she muttered, blushing furiously. The final guest, Reverend Simon Hale, arrived, his round spectacles and mild demeanor a contrast to the tension in the room. His clerical collar was pristine, his hands clasped before him as he offered a gentle smile. "Miss Marple, a delight," he said. "Your reputation for wisdom precedes you." "You are too kind, Reverend," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "I am merely an old woman who enjoys a good cup of tea and a puzzle." Tea was poured, and the conversation turned to the upcoming village fete, a topic Eleanor steered with practiced ease. Thomas spoke of the committee's plans, his voice loud but lacking warmth, while Lydia's contributions were brief, her eyes often straying to the window. Mrs. Baxter hovered, her presence a silent force, and Polly's clumsiness drew a sharp glance from Thomas when she spilled a drop of tea. Reverend Hale offered anecdotes about past fates, his tone soothing. But Miss Marple noted the undercurrents, Lydia's unease, Thomas's forced cheer, Eleanor's strained hospitality. The talk shifted to a recent theft in the Villager silver candlestick taken from the church, a minor scandal that had tongues wagging. Petty thieves, Thomas said dismissively, but his eyes flicked to Polly, who blushed and fumbled a scone. Mrs. Baxter's lips tightened, and Eleanor's fingers gripped her teacup. Such incidents are troubling, Miss Marple said, her tone light. In St. Mary Mead, we once had a similar thefter, silver teapot taken from the vicarage. It was found in the most unexpected place. The group murmured politely, but the tension remained. As the tea concluded, the guests dispersed. To his study, Lydia to the garden, Reverend Hale to the vicarage. Mrs. Baxter and Polly cleared the table, their movements brisk. Eleanor lingered, her hand on Miss Marple's arm. "Jane," she whispered, "I fear for Lydia. She's changed, secretive, withdrawn. And Thomas, he's pressing her about the estate. I don't know what to do." Miss Marple patted her hand, her eyes kind but alert. "My dear Eleanor, you have done right to call me. I shall observe, and we shall see what lies beneath." As Eleanor escorted her to the door, Miss Marple glanced at the rose garden, its blooms radiant but somehow ominous in the morning light. She stepped into the pony cart, her knitting bag at her side, her mind already sifting through the details. Lydia's restlessness, Thomas's ambition, Mrs. Baxter's severity, Polly's nerves, and Eleanor's fear. Chipping Barnet, like St. Mary Mead, was a village of secrets, and Miss Marple knew that secrets, like roses, often hid thorns. Chapter 2. The morning gathering. The morning room of Rose Cottage glowed with the soft light of an autumn sun, filtering through the bay window and casting a golden sheen across the floral wallpaper, its delicate rose pattern echoing the vibrant garden beyond. The room was a study in understated elegance, with a polished mahogany table draped in a lace cloth, its surface adorned with a silver tea service that gleamed like a mirror. Scones, freshly baked and fragrant, sat beside a crystal dish of strawberry jam and a bowl of clotted cream, their richness a testament to the hospitality of Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a cushioned chair near the window, her knitting bag at her feet, observed the scene with her characteristic quiet alertness. Her pale blue shawl, half finished, rested in her lap, her needles poised but still, as her sharp eyes took in every detail of the gathering. Eleanor Pritchard, her silver hair neatly pinned, presided over the tea with a grace that belied the strain Miss Marple had noted in her letter and demeanour. Her navy dress, simple yet impeccably tailored, accentuated her poised dignity, but her hands, as she lifted the teapot, betrayed a faint tremor. She poured with care, her hazel eyes flickering toward the door as if expecting an interruption. "Jane," she said, her voice warm but measured, "do try the scones. Mrs. Baxter's recipe is quite renowned in Chipping Barnet." Miss Marple smiled, her expression gentle but her mind alert. "They look delightful, Eleanor. You've always had a gift for creating such welcoming gatherings." Her words were kind, but her gaze lingered on Eleanor's hands, noting the slight hesitation as she passed a cup to her stepdaughter. Lydia Pritchard, a striking young woman of 28, stood near the table, her dark curls cascading over a green silk dress that shimmered in the sunlight. Her beauty was undeniable, but her movements were restless, her fingers twisting the stem of a rose she had plucked from a vase on the sideboard. She poured tea for the guests, her hand unsteady, causing a drop to spill onto the lace cloth. "Oh, bother," she muttered, her voice low, her cheeks flushing as she dabbed at the stain with the napkin. Miss Marple noted the tension in her posture, the way her dark eyes darted toward the other guests, as if seeking or avoiding something. Thomas Pritchard, Eleanor's nephew by marriage, lounged in a chair near the fireplace, his lean frame, clad in a sharply tailored grey suit, his dark hair slicked back with precision. His sharp features and piercing blue eyes gave him an air of calculated confidence. But Miss Marple observed a restlessness in his fingers, which tapped rhythmically on the armrest. He was engaged in a discussion about the upcoming village fete, his voice loud and authoritative. "The committee's in disarray, as usual," he said, addressing no one in particular. "They'll need a firm hand to sort out the stalls. I've offered my services, naturally." "Naturally," Lydia murmured, her tone edged with something Miss Marple couldn't quite place: sarcasm, perhaps, or resentment. Thomas's eyes flicked to her, a flash of irritation crossing his face before he resumed his commentary. Mrs. Agnes Baxter. The housekeeper stood near the door, her stout figure imposing in a plain black dress, her grey hair pulled into a severe bun that accentuated her pinched expression. Her hands, rough from years of service, smoothed her apron repeatedly, a nervous habit that did not escape Miss Marple's notice. She hovered ostensibly to oversee the tea service, but her eyes darted between the guests, lingering on Lydia, with a scrutiny that seemed more than professional. Polly, the young maid, entered with a fresh tray of scones, her blonde hair escaping its cap, her apron slightly askew. Her movements were clumsy, her hands trembling as she set the tray down, nearly upsetting a teacup. "Sorry, ma'am," she mumbled to Eleanor, her face crimson as she retreated to a corner, her eyes downcast. The final guest, Reverend Simon Hale, sat near Miss Marple, his round spectacles glinting in the sunlight, his clerical collar pristine against his black suit. His mild demeanor and soft voice exuded calm, but his eyes, Miss Marple noted, were keenly observant, missing little of the room's dynamics. "The fete will be a fine affair," he said, addressing Eleanor. "Your roses, Mrs. Pritchard, would make a splendid display. Perhaps a prize for the best bloom." Eleanor's smile was strained. "A kind thought, Reverend, but I fear my garden has been neglected of late. Other matters have demanded my attention." Miss Marple sipped her tea, the delicate flavor of Darjeeling masking the tension that simmered beneath the surface. The conversation turned to village matters, new shop on the high street, the repair of the church steeple, but Miss Marple's attention was on the interplay of glances and gestures. Lydia's restlessness was palpable, her fingers shredding the rose petal by petal. Thomas's forced cheer seemed a veneer, his eyes narrowing when Lydia spoke. Mrs. Baxter's vigilance was almost predatory, while Polly's nervousness suggested more than simple inexperience. Reverend Hale's calm was genuine, but his occasional glances toward Eleanor hinted at concern. The topic shifted to a recent incident in the villager, theft of a silver candlestick from the church, a minor scandal that had set tongues wagging. "Petty thieves," Thomas said, his tone dismissive, but his gaze settled on Polly, who flinched and dropped a spoon, the clatter loud in the quiet room. Mrs. Baxter's lips tightened, and she moved to retrieve the spoon, her movements brisk. "Such incidents are distressing," Miss Marple said, her voice mild but her eyes sharp. "In St. Mary Mead, we had a similar thefter, silver teapot from the vicarage. It was found in a most unexpected place, with a most unexpected person." The group murmured polite interest, but Miss Marple noted their reactions. Eleanor's forced smile, Lydia's distracted nod, Thomas's quick glance at Mrs. Baxter, and Polly's deepening blush. Reverend Hale offered a gentle comment about forgiveness, but his eyes lingered on Eleanor, as if sensing her unease. As the tea concluded, the guests began to disperse. Thomas excused himself to his study, citing paperwork. Lydia slipped out to the garden, her green dress a flash of color against the roses. Reverend Hale took his leave, promising to return for the fete planning. Mrs. Baxter and Polly cleared the table, their movements synchronized but tense. Eleanor lingered, her hand resting on the back of Miss Marple's chair. "Jane," she whispered, her voice low, "I meant what I said in my letter. Lydia is not herself. She's secretive, almost frightened, and Thomasy's been pressing her about the estate, about selling land. I fear there's something amiss." Miss Marple patted her hand, her eyes kind but probing. "My dear Eleanor, you've done right to confide in me. I shall stay a day or two, if you'll have me, and we shall see what lies beneath these troubles." Eleanor's relief was palpable, though her smile remained strained. "You're a godsend, Jane. I've arranged a room for you upstairs." As Miss Marple gathered her knitting bag, she glanced at the rose garden through the window, where Lydia stood among the blooms, her figure solitary and tense. The roses were radiant, but their beauty seemed a fragile mask for the discord within. Rose Cottage. Miss Marple's mind, as sharp as her needles, was already at work, piecing together the fragments of suspicion, Lydia's unease, Thomas's ambition, Mrs. Baxter's scrutiny, Polly's nerves, and Eleanor's fear. Chipping Barnet, she knew, was no different from St. Mary Mead's. Secrets were merely waiting to be unravelled. Chapter 3. The fatal the morning sun bathed Rose Cottage in a deceptive glow, its golden rays filtering through the bay window of the morning room, where the delicate rose-patterned wallpaper seemed to pulse with life. The air was fragrant, with the scent of freshly brewed tea and the roses drifting in from the garden. But an undercurrent of unease lingered, as if the house itself sensed the tragedy about to unfold. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cushioned chair, her knitting needles idle in her lap, her pale blue shawl folded neatly beside her. Her sharp eyes, hidden behind a gentle smile, observed the gathering with the precision of a watchmaker, noting every glance, every tremor, every unspoken word. The silver tea service gleamed on the lace-covered mahogany table, its elegance a stark contrast to the tension among the guests. Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, her silver hair catching the light, presided with a strained composure, her navy dress impeccable but her hazel eyes shadowed with worry. She had invited Miss Marple for a second morning tea, introducing a new guest, Dr. Margaret Vernon, a botanist whose presence added a fresh layer to the household's dynamics. The table was set with scones, a crystal dish of gooseberry jam, and a bowl of clotted cream, their richness a testament to Eleanor's effort to maintain normalcy. Lydia Pritchard, her dark curls framing a pale face, stood by the table, pouring tea with a hand that trembled more noticeably than the previous day. Her green silk dress, though elegant, seemed to hang heavily on her, her movements jerky as she filled the cups. Miss Marple noted the redness in her eyes, as if she had been crying, and the way her gaze darted toward the door, as if expecting or dreading someone's arrival. Thomas Pritchard sat near the fireplace, his sharp features set in a mask of indifference as he leafed through a newspaper, its headlines proclaiming a local election. His grey suit was as meticulous as ever, but his fingers betrayed a restless energy, tapping the armrest in a rhythm that suggested impatience. "The Fate Committee's a shambles," he remarked, his voice loud but lacking conviction. "Need my guidance to pull it off." Mrs. Agnes Baxter, the housekeeper, moved with brisk efficiency, her stout figure clad in a severe black dress, her grey bun tighter than ever. She adjusted the tea tray, her rough hands lingering on the teapot, her pinched expression softening only when addressing Eleanor. Miss Marple observed the way her eyes flicked toward Lydia, a scrutiny that bordered on disapproval. Polly, the young maid, hovered near the sideboard, her blonde hair escaping its cap, her apron stained with a smudge of jam. Her nervousness was palpable, her hands fumbling as she arranged a plate of scones, nearly knocking over a sugar bowl. "Sorry, ma'am," she muttered to Eleanor, her voice barely audible, her face flushed with embarrassment. Dr. Margaret Vernon, the botanist, was a brisk woman in her 40s, her tweed skirt and sensible blouse practical yet authoritative. Her brown hair was pulled into a neat bun, and her sharp grey eyes scanned the room with the precision of a scientist. She spoke of her research on local flora, her voice crisp as she described the medicinal properties of roses. "Your garden, Mrs. Pritchard, is a treasure," she said, her tone warm but professional. "I've found some fascinating specimens, nearby wild plants, quite potent." Eleanor's smile was polite but strained. "Your kind, Dr. Vernon. The roses are my solace, though I've had little time for them lately." Reverend Simon Hale, seated near Miss Marple, offered a gentle nod, his round spectacles reflecting the sunlight. His clerical collar was pristine, his demeanour calm, but his eyes lingered on Lydia with a concern that Miss Marple found telling. "The roses might inspire a sermon," he said softly. "Beauty amidst thorns, a fitting metaphor." The conversation drifted to the village fete, with Thomas dominating, his voice cutting through the room's quiet. Lydia, however, was distracted, her fingers shredding a napkin as she sipped her tea. Miss Marple watched closely, noting the faint tremor in her hand as she raised the cup to her lips. Suddenly, Lydia gasped, her eyes widening in shock. The cup slipped from her fingers, crashing to the table, its dark contents spilling across the lace cloth. She clutched her throat, her face contorting in pain, and collapsed to the floor, her green dress pulling around her like a fallen leaf. Dr. Vernon was at her side in an instant, her fingers searching for a pulse. "She's been poisoned," she exclaimed, her voice sharp with urgency. Her symptoms convulsions, the bitter scent it's likely a plant toxin. "Call a doctor at once." Eleanor froze, her teacup clattering to its saucer, her face ashen, poisoned. "Lydia, my dear girl." Her voice broke, and she sank into a chair, her hands trembling. Thomas stood, his newspaper forgotten, his sharp features pale but his eyes darting to the tea tray. "This is madness," he muttered, his voice low. "Who would do such a thing?" Mrs. Baxter shrieked, her hands flying to her mouth, her severe composure shattered. "Not my tea," she cried, stepping back from the table as if it were cursed. Polly, tears streaming down her face, fled the room, her sobs echoing down the hall. Reverend Hale knelt beside Lydia, murmuring a prayer, his hands clasped tightly, his face a mask of sorrow. Miss Marple, her knitting forgotten, knelt beside Dr. Vernon, her sharp eyes noting the spilled tea, its faint bitter scent distinct from the Darjeeling's aroma. "We must preserve the scene," she said calmly, her voice cutting through the chaos. "No one is to touch the tea service or the cup, Doctor." Vernon nodded, her composure returning. "The poison could be in the teapot or her cup alone. We'll need a chemist to test it." Eleanor, her voice trembling, clutched Miss Marple's arm. "Jane, what is this horror? Who could do this to Lydia?" Miss Marple patted her hand, her eyes never leaving the tea tray. "We shall find out, Eleanor, but we must act quickly." She rose, her movements deliberate, and approached the table, her gaze settling on the teapot. A faint residue clung to its spout, a detail she filed away for later. The cup, shattered on the floor, bore traces of the same dark liquid, its bitter scent unmistakable. "Constable Webb must be summoned," she said, her tone firm but gentle. "And the room must be sealed until he arrives." Thomas, his composure faltering, nodded. "I'll fetch him." He strode out, his footsteps echoing in the hall. Mrs. Baxter, regaining some of her severity, began to clear the table, but Miss Marple's voice stopped her. "Leave it, Mrs. Baxter. Every item may hold a clue." The housekeeper's hands froze, her eyes narrowing briefly before she stepped back, her lips tight. Reverend Hale, still kneeling, looked up, his spectacles fogged with emotion. "May God guide us through this darkness," he murmured. Dr. Vernon stood, brushing her skirt. "I'll stay with Lydia until the doctor arrives, but I fear it's too late." The poison acted swiftly. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The bitter scent, Dr. Vernon's mention of a plant toxin, the tension in the room all pointed to a deliberate act. But was Lydia the intended target, or had the poison been meant for another? She glanced at Eleanor, whose face was a mask of grief, and at the empty doorway where Polly had fled. The household was a tangle of motives, and Miss Marple knew that the truth, like the roses in the garden, was hidden among thorns. As the minutes ticked by, the morning room became a tableau of sorrow and suspicion, its cheerful decor a cruel irony against the tragedy within. Miss Marple resumed her seat, her knitting untouched, her eyes scanning the room. The tea service, the spilled cup, the nervous glances. She would unravel this mystery, one thread at a time. Chapter 4. The Constable's Inquiry. The morning room of Rose Cottage, once a haven of warmth and hospitality, now stood as a silent witness to tragedy. Its floral wallpaper and lace-covered table starkly at odds with the grim scene within. The golden sunlight streaming through the bay window seemed almost intrusive, illuminating the spot where Lydia Pritchard's body lay beneath a soft woolen shawl, her green silk dress a crumpled reminder of her final moments. The shattered teacup, its dark contents staining the lace cloth, sat untouched on the floor, a mute testament to the poison that had claimed her life. Miss Jane Marple, seated unobtrusively in her cushioned chair, her knitting bag at her feet, observed the room with a quiet intensity, her sharp eyes missing nothing, not the faint residue in the teapot spout, nor the nervous glances exchanged. Among the household, Constable Daniel Webb arrived within the hour, his bicycle propped hastily against the garden gate, his youthful face flushed from the ride but set with determination. He was a tall, earnest young man, his uniform slightly too large for his lanky frame, his notebook clutched tightly as he surveyed the scene. His experience in Chipping Barnet had been limited to petty thefts and drunken brawls, and the gravity of murder seemed to weigh heavily on his shoulders. "Mrs. Pritchard, Miss Marple," he said, his voice steady but betraying a hint of nerves. "This is a terrible business. I've sent for Dr. Hartley from the county hospital, but I'll need statements from everyone present. Miss Marple nodded, her expression gentle but her mind alert. A wise course, Constable. The tea service must be sent to a chemist for analysis. The poison, I believe, is in the teapot or the cup. Webb scribbled in his notebook, his brow furrowed. Right, ma'am, I'll have it bagged and sent to Dr. Grayson in town. Now, let's have the facts. Eleanor Pritchard, seated near the fireplace, her silver hair dishevelled for the first time, clasped her hands tightly, her hazel eyes brimming with tears. It was just tea, Constable, she said, her voice trembling. Mrs. Baxter and I prepared it together, as we always do. The leaves were from the caddy in the pantry, nothing unusual. Mrs. Agnes Baxter, standing rigidly by the sideboard, her severe bun accentuating her pinched expression, nodded curtly. That's right, sir, she said, her tone clipped. I fetched the tea from the caddy myself. Boiled the water, steeped it proper. No one tampered with it while I was there. Miss Marple's eyes flickered to the housekeeper, noting the defensiveness in her posture, the way her rough hands smoothed her apron repeatedly. And you were alone with the tray, Mrs. Baxter, before Polly brought it in? She asked, her voice mild. Mrs. Baxter's lips tightened. Only for a moment. Miss I left it in the kitchen while I fetched the scones. Polly was there, polishing. The silver Polly, summoned from the kitchen, stood trembling in the doorway, her blonde hair in disarray, her apron twisted in her hands. I didn't touch the tea, sir, she said, her voice breaking. I just carried the tray in, like Mrs. Baxter told me. I swear it. Constable Webb turned to Thomas Pritchard, who leaned against the mantel, his sharp features pale but composed. Mr. Pritchard, you were reading the paper, you said. Did you see anyone near the tea tray before Miss Lydia drank? Thomas's blue eyes narrowed slightly, his fingers pausing on the mantel. I was engrossed in the election news, Constable. I didn't notice the tray until Lydia poured the tea. She served herself first, as usual. Miss Marple's needles, now in her hands, clicked softly, a rhythmic counterpoint to the tension. And you, Dr. Vernon? She asked, turning to the botanist, who stood near the window, her tweed skirt and sensible blouse giving her an air of authority. Dr. Margaret. Vernon's grey eyes were steady, though her hands betrayed a slight tremor as she adjusted her bun. I noticed the tea had a bitter scent when Lydia spilled it, she said. It's likely a plant-based toxin, foxglove, perhaps, or something similar. I study local flora, Constable, and such plants grow wild near the cottage. But I assure you, I had no hand in this. Reverend Simon Hale, seated near Eleanor, his round spectacles fogged with emotion, spoke softly. I was outside, admiring the roses, until the tea was served. I saw nothing amiss, but poor Lydia. She was troubled of late, spoke of worries she wouldn't share. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the vicar, noting the genuine sorrow in his voice, but also the hint of knowledge behind his words. Troubled, Reverend? She asked gently. Did she mention what weighed on her? Hale hesitated, his hands clasped tightly. Only that she felt pressured. She didn't say by whom. Constable Webb scribbled furiously, his face a study in concentration. Right, then. The teapot and cup will go to the chemist. No one leaves the cottage until we've got answers. Miss Marple, you've a reputation for seeing things others miss. Any thoughts? Miss Marple's smile was demure, her knitting needles pausing. Only that we must consider the intended target, Constable, was the poison meant for Lydia, or did she drink from a cup meant for another? The tray was unattended, as Mrs. Baxter said, and the garden, with its wild plants, is accessible to all. Webb nodded, his brow creasing. I'll have the garden searched for any suspicious plants. Dr. Vernon, you'll assist with identifying them. Of course, Dr. Vernon replied, her tone crisp but cooperative as Webb moved to secure the tea service. Wrapping the teapot and cup in cloth for transport, Miss Marple approached the table, her eyes fixed on the spilled tea. The bitter scent was faint but unmistakable, a sharp contrast to the Darjeeling's floral notes. She noted the position of the cups. Lydia's was nearest the teapot, but others had been filled, untouched by the guests. The tray, she realized, was the key. Its brief, unattended moment in the kitchen, a window for mischief. Eleanor, still seated, looked up, her face etched with grief. Jane, how could this happen under my roof? Lydia was like a daughter to me. Miss Marple patted her hand, her voice soothing. We shall find the truth, Eleanor, but we must look closely at the tea, the garden, and the hearts of those. Here, Mrs. Baxter, hovering nearby, stiffened at the words, her eyes darting to Polly, who stood wringing her hands. Thomas, his composure regained, lit a cigarette, the smoke curling upward as he watched the constable with a guarded expression. Dr. Vernon moved to the window, her gaze fixed on the garden, while Reverend Hale murmured a prayer, his voice a soft anchor in the room's chaos. As Webb departed to summon the doctor and arrange for the chemist's analysis, Miss Marple resumed her seat, her knitting needles clicking once more. The morning room, with its cheerful decor, was now a stage for murder, its secrets hidden in the ordinary details of tea and roses. Lydia's death was no accident, and Miss Marple's mind, as sharp as ever, was already sifting through the clues. The bitter tea, the unattended tray, the garden's wild plants, and the unspoken tensions among the household. The truth, she knew, was close, waiting to be plucked like a thorn from the rose of Rose Cottage. Chapter 5. The botanist's clue. The rose garden of Rose Cottage, bathed in the soft light of a late morning sun, was a spectacle of colour and fragrance, its crimson, ivory, and blush blooms climbing trellises and spilling over stone walls. Yet the beauty was tinged with an ominous air, as if the roses themselves whispered of the tragedy that had unfolded within the cottage walls. Miss Jane Marple, her tweed coat neatly buttoned and her felt hat slightly tilted, walked the gravel path with a measured step, her knitting bag slung over her arm. Her sharp eyes, hidden behind a gentle demeanour, scanned the garden, noting the orderly rows of roses and the less tended patches where wild plants encroached. The death of Lydia Pritchard, poisoned by a sip of tea, had cast a shadow over Rose Cottage, and Miss Marple's mind was alert, sifting through the clues that lay not only in the morning room but in the very earth beneath her feet. Dr. Margaret Vernon, the botanist, stood near a cluster of damask roses, her tweed skirt and sensible blouse practical for her work, her brown hair pulled tightly into a bun. She held a small notebook, jotting observations about the plants, her grey eyes sharp with focus. Miss Marple approached, her knitting needles tucked away, her smile disarming but her purpose clear. Dr. Vernon, she said, her voice mild, your knowledge of flora is most impressive. I wonder if you might shed light on the poison that claimed poor Miss Lydia. Dr. Vernon looked up, her expression professional but guarded. Miss Marple, I've been thinking on it since yesterday. The symptoms: convulsions, the bitter scent in the tea point to a plant-based toxin. My suspicion is digitalis, from foxglove. It's deadly in high doses, and I've seen it growing wild near the cottage, just beyond the cultivated beds. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her face remained serene. Foxglove, you say? A gardener's mistake, perhaps, or a botanist's. Precision. Dr. Vernon's cheeks flushed slightly, but her tone remained steady. I study plants, Miss Marple, not poison them. Anyone with access to the garden could have picked it. Foxglove is common enough in these parts, and its leaves, when steeped, could easily taint a teapot. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting to a patch of wild plants near the compost heap, where tall, bell-shaped flowers stood among the weeds. And who tends this garden, besides Mrs. Pritchard? Mrs. Baxter, perhaps. Mrs. Baxter helps with the weeding, Dr. Vernon replied, her voice neutral. But she's no botanist. Eleanor Mrs. Pritchard knows her roses, but the wild patch is largely ignored. Anyone could have wandered there unnoticed. Miss Marple's fingers brushed a rose petal, its softness a contrast to the hardness of her thoughts. Indeed, and you, Dr. Vernon, were in the garden yesterday morning, were you not? Before the tea. Dr. Vernon's eyes narrowed briefly. I was studying the roses for my research. I noted the foxglove then, but I had no reason to touch it. My interest is in medicinal properties, not murder. Of course, Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. Yet knowledge is a powerful thing, is it not? In St. Mary Mead, we once had a case of poisoning belladonna, from a garden much like this. The culprit was the last person anyone suspected. Dr. Vernon's lips tightened, but she said nothing, returning to her notebook. Miss Marple moved toward the wild patch, her eyes scanning the foxglove. The plants were undisturbed, their leaves glossy and intact, but a small gap suggested a few had been plucked recently. She filed the observation away, her mind turning to the household. Returning to the cottage, Miss Marple sought out Polly, the young maid, in the kitchen, where the girl was polishing silver with a rag, her hands trembling as she worked. The kitchen was a warm, cluttered space, with copper pots hanging above a scrubbed oak table, but Polly's face was pale, her blonde hair falling into her eyes. Polly, Miss Marple said gently, seating herself at the table, you've had a dreadful shock, but you were in the kitchen when the tea was prepared. Did you see anything unusual? Polly's rag paused, her eyes filling with tears. No, miss, I swear. I was polishing, like Mrs. Baxter told me. She made the tea, and I just carried the tray in. I didn't touch nothing else. Miss Marple's smile was kind but probing. And Miss Lydia, she was troubled, wasn't she? I heard she argued with Mr. Thomas about money. Polly's blush deepened, her voice dropping to a whisper. Yes, miss. I heard them in the hall, day before yesterday. Miss Lydia was cross, said Mr. Thomas was cheating her, something about papers in his study. She said she'd tell Mrs. Pritchard. Everything. Miss Marple's needles, now in her hands, clicked softly. And Mrs. Baxter, she hear this argument? Polly nodded, her eyes darting to the door. She was in the pantry, but she came out when they raised their voices. She told Miss Lydia to mind her place. Miss Marple thanked her, her mind piecing together the fragments. Lydia's accusations, the foxglove in the garden, the unattended tea tray. She rose, her knitting bag in hand, and stepped into the hall, where Eleanor Pritchard was arranging roses in a vase, her movements mechanical, her face etched with grief. Eleanor, Miss Marple said softly. Lydia was concerned about the estate, was she not? Did she speak of Thomas's plans? Eleanor's hands froze on a rose stem, a thorn pricking her finger. She was upset, she admitted, her voice low. She thought Thomas was mismanaging funds, perhaps selling land without my consent. I told her to trust him, his family, but she was stubborn. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes lingering on the vase, its roses a vivid contrast to Eleanor's pallor, and the garden due tend the wild patch beyond the roses. Eleanor shook her head. No, that's Mrs. Baxter's domain. She weeds it when she has time, but it's overgrown. I've been distracted. Miss Marple patted her arm, her voice soothing. You've borne much, my dear, but we shall find the truth. As she left the hall, Miss Marple's mind was a whirl of connections. The foxglove, easily accessible to anyone in the household. Lydia's accusations against Thomas, Mrs. Baxter's proximity to both the tea and the garden. The poison was deliberate, but the question remained, had Lydia been the target, or had the tea been meant for another? The morning room, the garden, the secrets of Rose Cottage, they were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple knew that the truth, like a hidden thorn, would soon be revealed. Chapter 6. The nephew's ambition. The late afternoon light filtered through the leaded windows of Rose Cottage, casting intricate shadows across the polished oak floorboards of Thomas Pritchard's study, a room that seemed to embody his meticulous nature. The space was compact, its walls lined with bookshelves filled with legal tomes and ledgers, their spines worn from frequent use. A heavy desk dominated the center, its surface cluttered with papers, an inkstand, and a brass lamp that cast a warm glow over the documents. A locked safe, its iron door unyielding, stood in one corner, a silent guardian of secrets. Miss Jane Marple, her tweed coat folded over her arm, stood just inside the doorway, her knitting bag at her side. Her gentle demeanor a stark contrast to the room's austere purpose. Her sharp eyes, however, missed nothing the faint tremor. In Thomas's hand, as he sorted papers, the guarded expression in his blue eyes. The way his sharp features tightened when she entered. Thomas Pritchard looked up from his desk, his grey suit as immaculate as ever, though a bead of perspiration glistened on his brow despite the coolness of the room. Miss Marple, he said, his voice clipped but polite. This is a trying time for us all. I'm buried in work, but if you've questions, I'll do my best to answer. Miss Marple smiled, her expression disarming but her purpose unwavering. You are most kind, Mr. Pritchard. I shan't take much of your time. I understand you manage the estate's affairs for Mrs. Pritchard. It must be a considerable responsibility. Thomas's fingers paused on a ledger, his eyes narrowing slightly. It is. Aunt Eleanor trusts me to handle the finances, the land, the investments. It's no small task, especially with the estate's complexities. Miss Marple nodded, seating herself in a straight-backed chair opposite the desk, her knitting needles emerging from her bag as if by habit. Complexities, indeed. I heard, from a reliable source, that Miss Lydia was concerned about the estate. She spoke of discrepancies, perhaps in the accounts. Thomas's jaw tightened, his hand closing the ledger with a soft thud. Lydia was emotional, Miss Marple. She fancied herself wronged, always seeing slights where there were none. The estate's finances are sound, I assure you. She had no head for figures. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a rhythmic counterpoint to the tension in the room. Yet she was adamant, was she not? Polly overheard her in the hall, arguing with you about papers, in this very study, perhaps. Thomas's eyes flashed, a momentary lapse in his composure. Polly's a silly girl, prone to gossip. Lydia was upset about a minor matter, proposed sale of land, nothing more. She didn't understand the necessity. I was protecting Aunt Eleanor's interests. Protecting, Miss Marple repeated, her tone mild but her eyes sharp. Noble aim, Mr. Pritchard, and these papers might they be in that safe? Her gaze drifted to the iron box, its lock gleaming in the lamplight. Thomas followed her gaze, his fingers drumming briefly on the desk. The safe contains routine. Documents, deeds, contracts. Nothing Lydia would have understood. She was unstable, prone to hysterics. Miss Marple's smile remained gentle, but her mind was alert. In St. Mary Mead, we once had a young man, much like yourself, managing his uncle's affairs. He, too, spoke of protection, but his papers told a different story. It's curious how documents can reveal what words conceal. Thomas's lips thinned, but he forced a smile. I've nothing to hide, Miss Marple. My work is for the family's benefit. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've correspondence to attend to. Miss Marple rose, her knitting bag in hand. Of course, Mr. Pritchard, I shan't keep you from your duties. She paused at the door, her eyes lingering on the safe. But truth, like a garden, often requires digging to uncover its roots. Leaving the study, Miss Marple made her way to the drawing room, where Eleanor Pritchard sat alone, a vase of freshly cut roses on the table beside her. Her navy dress was creased, her silver hair slightly askew, her hazel eyes clouded with grief. Jane, she said, her voice low, this house feels like a tomb. Lydia's death, it's broken my heart. Miss Marple sat beside her, her tone soothing. My dear Eleanor, you bear a heavy burden. But tell me, did Lydia ever speak of Thomas's plans for the estate? Of selling land, perhaps? Eleanor's fingers tightened on a rose stem, a thorn drawing a bead of blood. She did, Jane. She was fierce about it, said the cottage and its land were her father's legacy, not to be sold. Thomas insisted it was necessary, that the estate was strained. I trusted him, but Lydia, she didn't. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes noting the blood on Eleanor's finger, a small but poignant detail. And these plans, were they documented? In Thomas's study, perhaps. Eleanor hesitated, her gaze drifting to the roses. He keeps everything in that safe. Lydia wanted to see the papers, but he refused. She was so angry, Jane. I thought it was just her temperament, but now... Miss Marple patted her hand, her mind racing. We shall find clarity, Eleanor. The truth is often hidden in the smallest details. As she left the drawing room, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the safe. Its iron door a barrier to secrets that might explain Lydia's death. The foxglove in the garden, the unattended tea tray. Lydia's accusations against Thomas all were threads in a tapestry of motive and opportunity. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a locked box had revealed a betrayal that shocked. The village, Thomas's ambition, she suspected, was a key piece of the puzzle. But whether he was the poisoner or a pawn remained unclear. Stepping into the hall, Miss Marple caught sight of Mrs. Baxter, the housekeeper, polishing a silver candlestick, with fierce intensity. Her severe bun and black dress gave her a formidable air, but her eyes, when they met Miss Marple's, held a flicker of unease. Mrs. Baxter, Miss Marple said gently, you must be weary with all this tragedy. You've served the Pritchards long, have you not? Mrs. Baxter's hands paused, her voice gruff. 20 years, Miss. I've seen this family through joys and sorrows, and through disputes, perhaps. Miss Marple's tone was light. Miss Lydia and Mr. Thomas they. argued, I hear. Mrs. Baxter's lips tightened. They had words. Yes, young folk often do. It's not my place to meddle. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes twinkling. Of course. But loyalty, it can blind us to truths, can it not? The housekeeper turned back to her polishing, her silence a wall. Miss Marple moved on, her knitting bag swinging gently, her mind alive. With possibilities, Thomas's ambition, Lydia's accusations, the locked safe, these were clues to a deeper truth, one that lay buried in the heart of Rose Cottage, waiting for her to unearth it. Chapter 7. The housekeeper's tale. The pantry of Rose Cottage was a narrow, utilitarian space, its shelves lined with jars of preserves, sacks of flour, and a gleaming array of silverware that spoke of meticulous care. The air was heavy with the scent of beeswax and dried herbs, a faint counterpoint to the lingering fragrance of roses that drifted from the garden beyond. Miss Jane Marple stood just inside the doorway, her tweed coat draped over a chair, her knitting bag resting on a scrubbed pine table. Her felt hat, with its single pheasant feather, sat neatly beside it, and her gentle demeanour belied the sharp scrutiny of her eyes as they settled on Mrs. Agnes Baxter, the housekeeper, who stood polishing a silver teapot with a vigour that suggested more than routine duty. The tragedy of Lydia Pritchard's poisoning had cast a pall over the household, and Miss Marple knew that the key to unravelling the mystery lay in the quiet corners where secrets were kept. Like dust swept under a rug, Mrs. Baxter's stout figure was clad in her usual severe black dress, her grey hair pulled into a bun so tight it seemed to stretch her pinched features. Her rough hands, reddened from years of scrubbing, moved rhythmically over the teapot, but her eyes darted toward Miss Marple with a wariness that was almost palpable. The housekeeper had been a fixture at Rose Cottage for 2 decades, her loyalty to the Pritchards unquestioned, yet Miss Marple sensed a tension beneath her stern exterior, a crack in the facade that might reveal more than intended. Mrs. Baxter, Miss Marple began, her voice soft and conversational, as if discussing the weather. You've kept this house in splendid order. It must be a comfort to Mrs. Pritchard, especially in these trying times. Mrs. Baxter's polishing slowed, her lips tightening briefly. It's my duty, miss, she said, her tone gruff but polite. Mrs. Pritchard's been good to me, and I do my best to keep things right. Miss Marple nodded, seating herself at the table, her knitting needles emerging from her bag as if by instinct. Indeed, and the tea service yesterday, it was beautifully prepared. You made the tea with Mrs. Pritchard, I understand. Mrs. Baxter's hands paused, the teapot glinting in the dim light of a single bulb overhead. Aye, miss. We used the Darjeeling from the caddy, same as always. Boiled the water, steeped it proper. Nothing out of the ordinary. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a soothing rhythm that seemed to ease the room's tension. And yet, something extraordinary happened, she said, her tone gentle but probing. The tea was poisoned, and poor Miss Lydia paid the price. You were alone with the tray for a moment, were you not, before Polly brought it to the morning room? Mrs. Baxter's eyes narrowed, her hands resuming their polishing with renewed vigour. Only a moment, miss, while I fetched the scones from the oven. The tray was in the kitchen, but I didn't see anyone touch it. Polly was there, polishing silver, clumsy as she is. Miss Marple's smile remained kind, but her eyes were sharp. Polly is young, prone to nerves. But you, Mrs. Baxter, you know the household's rhythms. You've tended the garden, too, I hear. Those wild plants beyond the roses. Perhaps. Mrs. Baxter's polishing faltered, a faint flush creeping into her cheeks. I weed when I can, miss, but the wild patch is overgrown. I don't meddle with those plants, nasty things, some of them. Mrs. Pritchard's the one for gardening, not me. Miss Marple nodded, her needles never missing a stitch. Of course. But you heard Miss Lydia's arguments with Mr. Thomas, did you not? Polly mentioned she was upset, speaking of papers and cheating. Mrs. Baxter's lips pursed, her hands gripping the teapot tightly. I heard them bickering, yes. Miss Lydia was always stirring trouble, saying Mr. Thomas was up to no good. It wasn't my place to listen, but she was loud enough in the hall. And you thought her accusations unfounded? Miss Marple asked, her tone as mild as if discussing a recipe. Mrs. Baxter hesitated, her eyes flicking to the door. She was headstrong, miss. Mr. Thomas has the family's interests at heart. He's been good to this house, managing things for Mrs. Pritchard. Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze steady. Loyalty is a fine thing, Mrs. Baxter, but it can blind us. In St. Mary Mead, we had a housekeeper once, devoted to her employer, who overlooked a theft because she couldn't bear to suspect those she served. The truth, it came out in the end. Mrs. Baxter turned back to her polishing, her silence heavy. Miss Marple rose, her knitting bag in hand, and stepped toward the door. Thank you, Mrs. Baxter. You've been most helpful. Leaving the pantry, Miss Marple made her way to the garden, where the roses glowed in the fading light. The wild patch, near the compost heap, drew her attention, its foxglove standing tall among the weeds. She knelt, her fingers brushing the soil, noting a few broken stems where leaves had been recently plucked. The discovery was subtle but significant, a clue to the poison's source, accessible to anyone with knowledge of the garden. Inside, Miss Marple found Eleanor Pritchard in the drawing room, arranging a vase of roses with mechanical precision. Her navy dress was creased, her silver hair slightly disheveled, her face etched with exhaustion. Jane, she said, her voice low, this house feels cursed. First Lydia, now all these questions. Miss Marple sat beside her, her tone soothing. We are close to the truth, Eleanor. Mrs. Baxter is loyal, but loyalty can hide much. Did she ever speak of Lydia's disputes with Thomas? Eleanor shook her head, a rose petal falling to the table. She's always been discreet, Jane. But she was fond of Thomas, trusted him. Lydia's accusations upset her, I think. Miss Marple nodded, her mind piecing together the fragments. The foxglove, the unattended tea tray, Mrs. Baxter's defensiveness. The housekeeper's loyalty to Thomas was a thread that might lead to the poisoner. But whether she acted alone or in concert remained unclear. As she left the drawing room, her knitting bag swinging gently, Miss Marple's thoughts were a tapestry of clues, each stitch bringing her closer to the truth hidden in the heart of Rose Cottage. Chapter 8. The Vicar's Observation. The Vicarage of Chipping Barnet. A modest stone building nestled beside the ancient church, exuded a quiet sanctity, its ivy-covered walls softened by the late afternoon light. Inside, the sitting room was a haven of simplicity, with plain oak furniture, a well-worn rug, and a fireplace where a small blaze crackled, casting a warm glow over shelves lined with theological volumes. Miss Jane Marple sat in a cushioned armchair, her knitting bag at her feet, the pale blue shawl in her lap untouched as she sipped a cup of Earl Grey offered by Reverend Simon Hale. Her tweed coat was draped over a chair, her felt hat resting beside it, its single pheasant feather catching the firelight. The tragedy of Lydia Pritchard's poisoning at Rose Cottage hung heavy, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes, masked by her gentle demeanour, were fixed on the vicar. whose mild manner and round spectacles belied a keen awareness of the villagers. Undercurrents. Reverend Hale sat opposite, his clerical collar slightly askew, his hands clasped around his own teacup, the steam curling upward like a prayer. His face, lined with the gentle wear of years spent tending his flock, was etched with sorrow, but his eyes held a spark of insight that Miss Marple found promising. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice soft but steady, "this is a dark time. For Chipping Barnet, Lydia's death is a wound to us all, and I fear for Mrs. Pritchard's strength." Miss Marple nodded, her smile kind but probing. "Indeed, Reverend, it is a grievous loss. You were a frequent visitor at Rose Cottage, were you not? You knew Miss Lydia well." Hale's spectacles glinted as he leaned forward, his hands tightening. "On the cup, I did, yes. She was a spirited young woman, full of life, but troubled of late. She came to me last week, seeking counsel, though she was reluctant to share details." Miss Marple's needles emerged from her bag, their soft clicking a soothing rhythm in the quiet room. "Troubled, you say? Did she speak of her concerns, perhaps? About the estate, or Mr. Thomas?" Hale hesitated, his gaze drifting to the fire. "She was vague, Miss Marple, but distressed. She mentioned feeling pressured, said Thomas was hiding something about the estate chapers. She thought that would ruin them. She feared he was betraying Mrs. Pritchard's trust." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained serene. "A serious accusation. And you saw nothing in the morning room to suggest how the poison reached her tea?" Hale shook his head, his voice heavy. "I was outside, admiring the roses, until the tea was served. But earlier that morning, I saw Mrs. Baxter in the garden, near the wild patch where the foxglove grows. She was agitated, picking something leaves, perhaps. I thought nothing of it then, but now." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind seizing on the detail. "Mrs. Baxter, in the wild patch. That is most interesting, Reverend. In St. Mary Mead, we had a gardener once, a quiet man who gathered herbs for his wife's remedies. It turned out he was gathering more than he admitted." Hale's eyes widened slightly, his hands clasping tighter. "You think Mrs. Baxter? But why? She's been loyal to the Pritchards for years." "Loyalty can take many forms," Miss Marple said gently. "Sometimes it blinds us to truth, or binds us to the wrong cause." "Did Lydia ever speak of Mrs. Baxter's feelings toward her?" Hale frowned, his spectacles slipping down his nose. "She hinted that Mrs. Baxter disapproved of her, called her headstrong. Lydia felt watched, she said, as if her every move was judged." Miss Marple nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm. "And Mr. Thomas, did she confide anything specific about his actions?" "Only that she'd found papers in his study," Hale replied. "She didn't say what, but she was determined to confront him. I urged her to speak to Mrs. Pritchard first, but she was stubborn." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind piecing together the fragments. Mrs. Baxter in the wild patch, Lydia's discovery of papers, the poisoned tea. As she rose, her knitting bag in hand, she glanced at the vicarage window, where the church spire loomed against a fading sky. "You've been most helpful, Reverend. The truth is like a sermon, it requires patience to uncover its meaning." Hale escorted her to the door, his expression troubled. "May God guide you, Miss Marple. This village needs light in this darkness." Stepping into the cool evening air, Miss Marple made her way back to Rose Cottage, her thoughts a whirl of connections. The foxglove, accessible to all but noticed by Mrs. Baxter. Lydia's accusations against Thomas, The vicar's observation of the housekeeper's agitation were threads in a tapestry of deceit. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a vicar's innocent remark had unravelled a theft, and she knew Hale's words were a vital clue. At the cottage, she found Eleanor Pritchard in the hall, arranging a fresh bouquet of roses, her hands trembling slightly. "Jane," Eleanor said, her voice low, "Constable Webb says the chemist's report will come tomorrow. I can't bear this waiting." Miss Marple patted her arm, her eyes kind but alert. "Patience, Eleanor. The truth is near." "Did Mrs. Baxter ever speak of Lydia's disputes with Thomas?" Eleanor shook her head, a rose petal falling to the floor. She was tight-lipped, as always, but she defended Thomas, said Lydia was too emotional. "I trusted her judgment, Jane, but now I wonder." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting to the garden beyond, where the wild patch lay hidden in shadow. Mrs. Baxter's loyalty, Lydia's suspicions, the foxglove, they were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple's mind, as sharp as her needles, was stitching them together, one careful thread at a time. Chapter 9. The Hidden Document. The evening shadows lengthened across Rose Cottage, cloaking its ivy-clad walls in a sombre twilight that seemed to mirror the weight of Lydia Pritchard's death. Miss Jane Marple, her tweed coat neatly folded over her arm, stood in the dimly lit hall, the faint scent of roses mingling with the polish of old wood. Her knitting bag hung at her side, a familiar companion, but her sharp eyes were fixed on the closed door of Thomas Pritchard's study, where secrets, she suspected, lay locked away like seeds beneath the soil. The tragedy of the poisoned tea had stirred the household into a quiet frenzy, and Miss Marple's mind, ever alert, was piecing together the clues. The foxglove in the garden, Mrs. Baxter's agitation, Lydia's accusations against Thomas, and now, the tantalizing possibility of papers that might reveal the truth. With Constable Daniel Webb's permission, secured after a brief conversation about the need to examine routine documents, Miss Marple entered the study alone, the constable occupied with interviewing Dr. Vernon about the garden's flora. The room was as she remembered, compact, with bookshelves of legal tomes, a heavy oak desk cluttered with papers, and the iron safe in the corner, its lock glinting in the light of a single brass lamp. The air was heavy with the scent of ink and leather, and a faint draught from a cracked window stirred the papers, as if the room itself were restless. Miss Marple seated herself at the desk, her knitting bag placed carefully on the floor, her movements deliberate but unhurried. She examined the paper's ledger's letters, a draft of the village fates schedule, but her attention was drawn to a locked drawer in the desk's lower right corner, its brass keyhole a silent challenge. She recalled a trick taught by her mischievous nephew Raymond, who, as a boy, had once unlocked a biscuit tin with a hairpin. From her bag, she retrieved a small hairpin, its simplicity belying its utility, and with a deft twist, she coaxed the lock open, her hands steady despite her age. Inside the drawer lay a single document, its edges crisp, its ink fresh. Miss Marple unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the text. A contract for the sale of a portion of Rose Cottage's land, a meadow valued for its proximity to the village, with a sum that made her eyebrows rise. The signature at the bottom was Lydia Pritchard's, but the handwriting was uneven. The loops and flourishes, unlike the bold script Miss Marple had seen on Lydia's letters in the drawing room. It was a forgery, she was certain, and the implications were Artemis had been planning to sell the land without Eleanor's consent, and Lydia had discovered it. Miss Marple slipped the document into her bag, her mind racing. The forgery was a motive for murder, a reason to silence Lydia before she could expose Thomas's deceit. Yet the poison, steeped in the tea, suggested another hand, Mrs. Baxter, perhaps, whose loyalty to Thomas had been evident in her defensive words. Or was there another player in this deadly game? She rose, her knitting bag in hand, and made her way to the morning room, where Eleanor Pritchard sat alone, a cup of untouched tea before her, the rose-patterned wallpaper a cruel reminder of happier times. Eleanor's navy dress was creased, her silver hair loose, her hazel eyes hollow with grief. "Jane," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "Constable Webb says the chemist's report will confirm foxglove. How could such evil come to my home?" Miss Marple sat beside her, her tone soothing but firm. "Evil, Eleanor, often hides in plain sight. Tell me, did Lydia ever show you papers from Thomas's study? Anything about the estate's land?" Eleanor's hands trembled, a rose petal falling from the vase beside her. "She tried, once, a week ago. She said Thomas was planning to sell the meadow, that he'd forged her name. I thought she was exaggerating, Jane. She was so emotional, and Thomas assured me it was nonsense." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes kind but piercing. "And you trusted Thomas's word?" Eleanor hesitated, her fingers twisting a handkerchief. "He's family, Jane. Harold trusted him, and I didn't want to believe Lydia's accusations, but now I wonder if I was blind." Miss Marple patted her hand, her mind turning to the document in her bag. "We shall see, Eleanor. The truth is like a rose it blooms when tended properly." Leaving the morning room, Miss Marple sought out Thomas, finding him in the garden, pacing among the roses, a cigarette glowing in his hand. His sharp features were taut, his blue eyes narrowed as he saw her approach. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone clipped, "this is a trying time. Have you more questions?" "Only one, Mr. Pritchard," she said, her voice mild but her eyes unyielding. "Lydia believed you were forging documents to sell the estate's land. She spoke of papers in your study. Were her accusations true?" Thomas's cigarette paused mid-air, his face paling. "She was hysterical, Miss Marple. I told you, she didn't understand business. The estate needs funds, and selling land is practical. She had no right to interfere." Miss Marple's smile was gentle but probing. "Interference or exposure. Mary Mead, we had a young man who forged a will to secure his future. The truth came out when a single document was found." Thomas's eyes flashed, but he forced a laugh. "You're fanciful, Miss Marple. I've nothing to hide." As he strode back to the cottage, Miss Marple lingered among the roses, her gaze drifting to the wild patch where foxglove grew. The forged document, Lydia's accusations, Mrs. Baxter's loyalty, all were threads in a tapestry of deceit, and the poison in the tea was the needle that had stitched it together. Miss Marple's mind, as sharp as her knitting needles, was weaving the pattern, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 10. The Maid's Confession. The scullery of Rose Cottage was a dim, cramped space, its stone walls cool and damp despite the warmth of the late afternoon. Copper pots hung from hooks, their surfaces gleaming faintly under a single bulb, and a narrow window offered a glimpse of the rose garden, its blooms now shadowed by the encroaching dusk. Miss Jane Marple stood near the scrubbed oak table, her knitting bag resting beside a stack of freshly washed dishes, her tweed coat folded neatly over a chair. Her felt hat, its pheasant feather catching the light, sat atop the table. But her sharp eyes were fixed on Polly, the young maid, who stood trembling, her blonde hair in disarray, her apron twisted in her nervous hands. The tragedy of Lydia. Pritchard's poisoning had left the household in a state of quiet turmoil, and Miss Marple knew that the truth often lay with those who hovered on the edges. Unnoticed yet all-seeing, Polly's face was pale, her eyes red from crying, and her voice quavered as she polished a silver spoon with a rag, more to occupy her hands than to achieve any shine. "Miss, I don't know what to say," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the spoon. "It's been awful, with Miss Lydia gone and all these questions." Miss Marple's smile was kind, her tone as soothing as a lullaby. "My dear Polly, you've had a dreadful shock. But you see much in this house, do you not? Things others might overlook." Polly's hands stilled, her eyes darting to the door as if fearing interruption. "I try to do my work, miss, and not meddle. But I can't stop thinking about that. Tea." Miss Marple seated herself at the table, her knitting needles emerging from her bag, their soft clicking a gentle rhythm in the quiet scullery. "The tea, yes. You carried the tray to the morning room, but it was prepared in the kitchen. Did you see Mrs. Baxter with the teapot before it was brought in?" Polly's blush deepened, her fingers twisting the rag. I did, miss. She was stirring something in the teapot after she'd steeped the tea. I thought it was sugar or some such, but it wasn't the usual way. I was polishing silver, like she told me, and didn't think to ask." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes twinkling with interest. "Something extra, you say? And this was before the tray was brought to the morning room?" Polly nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Yes, miss. I should have said something, but I was scared. Mrs. Baxter's strict, and I didn't want trouble. I didn't know it was poison, I swear." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, her gaze steady. "You've done right to tell me now, Polly. Did Mrs. Baxter know of Miss Lydia's arguments with Mr. Thomas? About the estate, perhaps?" Polly's voice dropped to a whisper, her eyes flicking to the door again. She heard them, Miss 2 days ago, in the hall. Miss Lydia was shouting that Mr. Thomas was cheating, hiding papers in his study. Mrs. Baxter came out of the pantry and told her to hush. Said she was making a fuss over nothing, but she looked cross, miss, like she was protecting Mr. Thomas. Miss Marple nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm. "And you, Polly, did you ever see these papers Miss Lydia spoke of?" Polly shook her head, her tears spilling over. "No, miss. But I heard Miss Lydia tell Mrs. Pritchard she'd found something in the study, something that had ruined Mr. Thomas. I didn't see nothing myself." Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "You've been brave, Polly. In St. Mary Mead, we had a maid once, much like you, who saw something she didn't understand at the time. Her words helped catch a thief. Small truths lead to great ones." Polly managed a shaky smile, wiping her eyes with the rag. "I just want this to be over." Miss Marple rose, her knitting bag in hand, and stepped toward the door. "It will be, my dear. Truth has a way of coming to light." Leaving the scullery, Miss Marple made her way to the drawing room, where Eleanor Pritchard sat by the fireplace, a vase of roses on the table beside her, their crimson petals vivid against her pallor. Her navy dress was creased, her silver hair loose, her hazel eyes distant with grief. "Jane," she said, her voice low, "the chemist's report is due tomorrow. I fear what it will confirm." Miss Marple sat beside her, her tone soothing but firm. "It will confirm foxglove, Eleanor, but it will also point us to the truth. Mrs. Baxter was close to the tea and to Thomas. Did she ever speak of his plans for the estate? Eleanor's fingers tightened on a handkerchief, a rose petal falling to the floor. She was loyal to him, Jane. She said Lydia's accusations were nonsense, that Thomas was saving the estate. I believed her, but now I'm not sure. Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving the threads. Polly's confession, Mrs. Baxter's actions with the teapot, the forged document in Thomas's study. The housekeeper's loyalty to Thomas was a motive, but whether she acted alone or at his behest remained unclear. As she left the drawing room, her knitting bag swinging gently, Miss Marple's thoughts were a tapestry of clues, each stitch bringing her closer to the heart of the mystery hidden in Rose Cottage. Chapter 11. The Gathering of Suspects. The Morning Room of Rose Cottage. Once a sanctuary of warmth and elegance, now bore the weight of tragedy. Its floral wallpaper and lace-covered table, a stark contrast to the somber mood that enveloped it. The late morning sun streamed through the bay window, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany where the silver tea service, now a grim relic of Lydia Pritchard's death, had been carefully removed by Constable Webb for analysis. Miss Jane Marple stood near the fireplace, her slight figure in a neat tweed coat commanding the room with quiet authority. Her knitting bag at her feet, the pale blue shawl folded neatly beside it. Her sharp eyes, hidden behind a gentle smile, surveyed the assembled household, each face a study in tension, guilt, or sorrow. As the spectre of murder hung heavy in the air, Eleanor Pritchard sat nearest the window, her silver hair loose, her navy dress creased from sleepless nights, her hazel eyes clouded with grief. Thomas Pritchard leaned against the mantel, his sharp features taut, his grey suit impeccable but his blue eyes wary, a cigarette smouldering between his fingers. Mrs. Agnes Baxter stood by the door, her stout figure rigid in her severe black dress, her grey bun tight, her pinched expression betraying a flicker of unease. Polly, the young maid, hovered in a corner, her blonde hair escaping its cap, her apron twisted in her trembling hands, her face pale with fear. Dr. Margaret Vernon, the botanist, sat with her tweed skirt smoothed, her sharp grey eyes alert but composed, her notebook clutched tightly. Reverend Simon Hale, his round spectacles glinting, his clerical collar pristine, sat beside Eleanor, his hands clasped in a gesture of quiet prayer. Constable Daniel Webb stood near Miss Marple, his lanky frame awkward in his oversized uniform, his notebook open but his pen still, his youthful face set with determination. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice steady but tinged with deference, "you've a way of seeing things we miss. I've gathered everyone, as you asked. The chemist's report is due soon, but I'd value your thoughts now." Miss Marple's smile was demure, her hands clasped before her, her eyes sweeping the room. "Thank you, Constable. A murder has been committed in this house, a most wicked act. Lydia Pritchard was poisoned with foxglove, steeped in her tea, a deliberate deed that speaks of greed and betrayal. Let us consider the facts." She turned to Eleanor, her tone gentle but firm. "Mrs. Pritchard, you prepared the tea with Mrs. Baxter, believing it routine. Yet the poison found its way into the teapot, or perhaps Lydia's cup alone. Your grief is great, but did you sense any discord in the household that might point to a motive?" Eleanor's hands trembled, a handkerchief crumpled in her fingers. "I trusted everyone, Jane. Lydia was troubled, yes, but I thought it was her temperament. I never imagined such evil." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze shifting to Thomas. "Mr. Pritchard, Lydia accused you of mismanaging the estate, of forging papers to sell land. Those papers, found in your study, confirm her fears. Did she threaten to expose you? Thomas's cigarette paused mid-air, his eyes narrowing. She was mistaken, Miss Marple. I acted for the estate's benefit. Her accusations were wild, emotional. I had no reason to harm her. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained serene, yet the forged signature suggests otherwise. In St. Mary Mead, a forged will once led to a bitter feud. Secrets, Mr. Pritchard, have a way of surfacing. She turned to Dr. Vernon, her voice mild. Dr. Vernon, your knowledge of Foxglove made you a suspect, but your presence as a guest suggests you had little to gain. Yet you saw the plants in the garden. Did you notice anyone tending them? Dr. Vernon's grey eyes met hers, steady but cautious. I saw Mrs. Baxter near the wild patch, as I told you, but I was focused on my research, not on who might misuse the plants. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze shifting to Reverend Hale. Reverend, you observed Mrs. Baxter in the garden, picking leaves, and heard Lydia's fears about Thomas. Your counsel was sought, yet the poison struck. Did you see anything amiss in the morning room? Hale's spectacles fogged slightly, his voice soft. I was outside until the tea was served, Miss Marple. I saw nothing but Lydia's distress. Weighed on me. I wish I'd acted sooner. Miss Marple's eyes settled on Mrs. Baxter, who stiffened under her gaze. Mrs. Baxter, you prepared the tea, and Polly saw you add something to the teapot. You heard Lydia's accusations against Thomas, whom you've served loyally. Did you act to protect him? Mrs. Baxter's face flushed, her hands clenching her apron. I did no such thing, Miss. I steeped the tea, as always. Polly's a silly girl, imagining things. I'd never harm Miss Lydia. Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but unyielding. Loyalty can lead us astray, Mrs. Baxter. Polly's words and the foxglove in the garden suggest otherwise. The truth is near, and it will not stay hidden. The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Eleanor's handkerchief was a crumpled ball, Thomas's cigarette burned to ash, Dr. Vernon's notebook creaked under her grip, and Polly's tears fell silently. Reverend Hale murmured a prayer, while Mrs. Baxter's eyes darted to the door. As if seeking escape, Constable Webb cleared his throat. Miss Marple, you've laid it out clear. The chemist's report will tell us more, but I'm ready to act. On your lead, Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the room once more. We are close, Constable. The truth, like a rose, blooms when its thorns are faced. As the group dispersed, their whispers trailing behind, Miss Marple remained by the fireplace, her knitting untouched, her mind a whirl of clues. The forged document, Polly's confession, Mrs. Baxter's loyalty. The poisoner was among them, and the final piece of the puzzle was within reach. Chapter 12. The truth revealed. The morning room of Rose Cottage, bathed in the pale light of a cloudy afternoon, stood as a silent stage for the unraveling of a grim mystery. The floral wallpaper, once cheerful, now seemed to wilt under the weight of Lydia Pritchard's murder, and the lace-covered mahogany table, stripped of its silver tea service, bore the faint stain of spilled tea, a lingering echo of the poison that had claimed her life. Miss Jane Marple stood before the fireplace, its embers barely glowing, her slight figure in a neat tweed coat commanding the room with a quiet authority that belied her unassuming appearance. Her knitting bag rested at her feet, the pale blue shawl folded within, untouched, as her sharp eyes swept over the assembled household. Each face a canvas of fear, guilt, or sorrow. Eleanor Pritchard sat by the bay window, her silver hair dishevelled, her navy dress crumpled, her hazel eyes glistening with unshed tears. Thomas Pritchard leaned against the mantel, his sharp features pale, his grey suit pristine, but his blue eyes flickering with unease. A cigarette extinguished in his hand. Mrs. Agnes Baxter stood rigidly near the door, her severe black dress and tight grey bun accentuating her pinched expression, her rough hands clenched at her sides. Polly, the young maid, hovered in a corner, her blonde hair loose, her apron twisted, her face streaked with tears. Dr. Margaret Vernon sat with her tweed skirt smoothed, her grey eyes calm but watchful, her notebook closed on her lap. Reverend Simon Hale, his round spectacles reflecting the dim light, his clerical collar stark against his black suit, clasped his hands, his face heavy with sorrow. Constable Daniel Webb stood beside Miss Marple, his lanky frame tense, his notebook open, his youthful determination tempered by deference to her insight. "Miss Marple," Webb said, his voice steady but expectant. "The chemist's report confirms foxglove in the T. digitalis, lethal in the dose found. You've gathered us here, and I trust you've pieced it together. Who poisoned Miss Lydia?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her hands clasped before her, her eyes piercing as they met each gaze in turn. "A murder most cruel has been committed. In this house," she began, her voice clear and measured, "and the truth, like a rose, has thorns that must be faced. Lydia Pritchard was poisoned with foxglove, steeped in the tea she drank, a deliberate act rooted in secrets of greed and loyalty. Let us unravel the threads." She turned to Eleanor, her tone soft but resolute. "Mrs. Pritchard, your grief is profound, yet you trusted those around you. You prepared the tea with Mrs. Baxter, believing it safe, but the poison entered the teapot, a betrayal under your roof." Eleanor's handkerchief trembled in her hands, her voice a whisper. "I trusted them, Jane. I never thought, not in my home." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze shifting to Thomas. "Mr. Pritchard, Lydia discovered your forgery a contract to sell the estate's meadow with her signature falsified. She threatened to expose you, a motive for silence. Yet you were not near the tea tray when it was prepared." Thomas's face paled, his voice sharp. "I told you, Miss Marple, she was mistaken. I acted for the estate's good. I had no hand." In her death, Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, her tone unwavering. "Perhaps not directly, Mr. Pritchard, but your actions set a chain in motion. In St. Mary Mead, a forged deed once led to a desperate act. Motives, they ripple outward." She turned to Dr. Vernon, her voice mild. "Dr. Vernon, your knowledge of foxglove raised suspicion, but as a guest, your motive is thin. You saw Mrs. Baxter in the garden near the wild patch, but you did not act." Dr. Vernon's grey eyes met hers, steady. "I study plants, Miss Marple, not murder. I had no reason to harm Lydia." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze settling on Reverend Hale. "Reverend, you heard Lydia's fears about Thomas and saw Mrs. Baxter's agitation in the garden. Your counsel was kind, but the poison struck before you could intervene." Hale's spectacles fogged, his voice soft. "I failed her, Miss Marple. I saw nothing in the morning room to stop this tragedy." Miss Marple's eyes finally rested on Mrs. Baxter, who stiffened, her hands clenching tighter. "Mrs. Baxter," she said, her voice gentle but relentless, "you prepared the tea, and Polly saw you add something to the teapots, something not meant for sweetness. You heard Lydia's accusations against Thomas, whom you've served loyally for years. You picked foxglove from the garden, believing a small dose would silence her, protect Thomas's plans. Mrs. Baxter's face crumpled, her voice rising. In a cry, I only meant to scare her. Miss BC was ruining everything, stirring up trouble, threatening Mr. Thomas. I thought a bit of foxglove would make her ill, quiet her down. I didn't know it'd kill her. The room gasped, Eleanor's handkerchief falling to the floor, Thomas's cigarette slipping from his fingers. Polly sobbed, Dr. Vernon's notebook creaked, and Reverend Hale's hands clasped tighter, his lips moving in silent prayer. Miss Marple continued, her tone compassionate but firm. You misjudged the dose, Mrs. Baxter, and Lydia paid the price. Your loyalty to Thomas blinded you. But the truth cannot be hidden. The foxglove, the unattended tray, Polly's witness all point to you. Constable Webb stepped forward, his face grim. Mrs. Agnes Baxter, you're under arrest for the murder of Lydia Pritchard. Mrs. Baxter collapsed into a chair, sobbing. As Webb gently took her arm, Eleanor rose, her face ashen, and approached Miss Marple. Jane, you've saved us from further ruin. Thank you. Miss Marple patted her hand, her eyes kind. The truth, Eleanor, is often painful, but it sets us free. As Webb led Mrs. Baxter away, the household dispersed, their whispers trailing into silence. Miss Marple lingered by the fireplace, her knitting untouched, her mind reflecting on the tragedy. Thomas's greed had sparked the motive, but Mrs. Baxter's loyalty had wielded the poison. The roses of Rose Cottage would bloom again, but their thorns had drawn blood. The end